Imagine your life as a play, and in this script, the planets are the primary actors, each with a distinct role. And just as an actor's performance and motivations directly impact the plot, the planets represent the core functions and mechanics of your personality. They are the fundamental energies that define who you are, just as they are fundamental and physically tangible bodies that actually exist in space. For example, the sun is the actor playing the role of your core vitality and your identity, and Saturn is the actor who handles the themes of responsibility and structure, whereas Mercury is the actor responsible for all of that dialogue, representing the very mechanic of your mind and how you communicate. But what about the angles in our chart, such as the Ascendant or our Midheaven? Or what about Lilith, Black Moon Lilith, or even the North and South Node? Those kind of act as the framework that the play operates within, or that influence the direction of the play. It's the stage direction, the lighting, the cues, and the plot. And this is apparent because these points are not concrete objects in space. They are calculated points dependent on the layout of the Earth, the Moon, or the sky in any given moment. And these set the stage for our lives, so to speak. And so aspects made to these points will play out a little bit differently to aspects made to the planets because they aren't just shifting our being, they are shifting the layout of the script and the play that is our lives. And so today we will be talking about aspects made to different points in astrology that don't get enough attention. And so we will be covering the Ascendant, the Descendant, the IC, the MC, Black Moon Lilith, and the North and South nodes. And I know what you're thinking, we won't be covering Chiron? Well, that's because aspects made to Chiron are a bit more similar to aspects made to the planets, given that Chiron is an actual solid mass in space similar to a planet. And so now, what do the aspects to these points that I'm referring to actually tell you? And so first, I will briefly go over it, and then I will go into some examples of subscribers' birth charts showing how this may play out. And yes, everybody consented to this video, so don't at me in the comments like last time, okay? Starting with the angles, so the angles show the layout of the sky when you were born. Starting with the Ascendant, it's kind of that point in the horizon as the sky rises from the Earth's point of view. That's why it's called your rising sign. And so the second you were born, your Ascendant is calculated by what sign was on that horizon point. And so this is the lens or the mask through which your entire personality is projected. It's the framing of your personal identity. And so aspects made to the Ascendant may impact either how you appear or your own view of yourself. And so a good example is I actually have Venus square my natal Ascendant, and I have a lot of self-esteem issues related to my parents. Don't worry, I'm working on it, because the frame in which I was born in is at odds with the frame of energy that I typically value or see aesthetically pleasing, if that makes sense. But also, I do have Moon conjunct my Ascendant. And so there's almost like this sweetsy or warm and sometimes emotional aura that frames my way of being that is impossible to hide. That's just a few examples. Moving on to the Midheaven. The Midheaven is represented by the highest point in the sky the second you were born, and this frames your public role. It's not who you are, but the role you are most seen playing the world. And so your sun, which is your core identity, could be very private, but your Midheaven will describe that public scaffolding that you are meant to build, which your sun will then either support or feel at odds with. And so a planet aspecting your Midheaven could influence how your public role is perceived. And so, for example, with conjunctions and oppositions, this planetary energy will directly impact how you are perceived. And this is because that planetary energy is either visible within your Midheaven, or that energy kind of like counterbalances it, which will make an impact on how that Midheaven energy kind of is perceived by the world. With trines and sextiles, for example, it shows what parts of you easily align with your public role, but then with the square, it shows what parts of you could have trouble syncing with that Midheaven, or what energy is requiring active effort to channel effectively. A good example, I have Uranus making an exact square to my Midheaven, and so there's something about my public reputation that may appear very reliable and grounded to people, but within my work, for example, I like to be a little bit weird, and And so to be a little bit weird, but to also be a little bit reliable can be a very hard thing to balance. But if you do it right, you do it right. And if you don't do it right, you struggle with visibility. That's how the midheaven works. The descendant, this is the calculated point on the horizon where the sky is setting from the Earth's point of view, and it's opposite of the ascendant. And therefore, this frames your one-on-one encounters. It shapes sort of the role that other people play in your life. It describes the themes and energies you are wired to encounter and to partner with through another. And this is kind of connected to the ascendant. As I said, it is opposite, and so aspects will instead frame your connections as opposed to framing yourself, or sometimes they'll frame both, because you and your identity is kind of always going to be living in sync with how you relate to others. That's just a fact of life. And then moving on to the IC, this is the part of the sky that is completely unseen and falls opposite of your midheaven. And it is the sign the lowermost point of the earth is pointing towards the second you are born. And this frames your private foundation. It's the set of your innermost life, your roots, and your psychological anchor point. And the same thing with the midheaven, it connects to the midheaven because it is opposite. And so any aspects made to this point will color a more internal, private, or security-based framing of your life, which will inevitably be connected to that public role that you play, because you can't have one without the other. Moving on to the nodes, the north and south nodes. The nodes represent the 2 points where the elliptical, or the Earth's path, intersects with the moon's orbital path. The north node is that point as celestial latitude goes from south to north, hence the north node, and the south node is that point as the celestial latitude goes from north to south. And the nodes are not parts of your personality, but rather the plot, or the narrative arc of your life, which I released a video on actually last Saturday if you want to watch more about what the nodes actually mean. And this represents a directional pull or a karmic trajectory, and they frame your entire life story as a journey from one set of familiar energies towards another set of energy that's meant to be explored. And so the South Node, it frames your backstory. It's the comfort zone, the default setting, and the past, whether this life or other lives, which some people, think that the South Node represents your past lives, but I'll leave that up for interpretation. And this is the energy that you kind of move away from, but that you rely on. It's a set of talents that come so easily that they can become a rut, but you still gotta lean on them and use them as a talent. And then the North Node is the energy that is sort of framed, and it's the energy that you're being pulled towards that could enhance your life, or that energy is enhanced in your life at the very least. And it's the uncomfortable new direction that you are being pulled towards to find fulfillment. This is the plot line that your soul is trying to write, and it often feels like the area where you are the least competent but the most compelled to grow. And so aspects to both nodes show what energies will be integral to your journey, whether it's flowing, direct, or more tense, which, as I said, I do have a lot more info on if you want to go watch my Nodal video. And then finally, Black Moon Lilith. Astronomically, this is the lunar apogee, and if you don't know what this means, it's the furthest point in the moon's elliptical oval-shaped path around the Earth. It's the furthest point from the Earth at any given moment, which could be very different depending on where the Earth is. And so just know that Lilith is a very complex point. It's not a core personality point like the moon or Venus, and instead it frames a very specific psychological experience. It represents a point of the raw, the untamed, the exiled, and the instinctual. And the fact that it is the furthest point from the Earth in the moon's elliptical is almost aligned with the fact that this point aligns with our shadow side, and it often frames where you feel misunderstood or othered. Maybe you're pulled towards raw, unapologetic self-expression with this point. It could be a point of subconscious intensity or shadow, but it could also be a point where you refuse to compromise or to be tamed. And so when planets aspect this point, it shows how your energy relates to this untamed energy. So conjunctions could feel directly linked. Trines and sextiles may be energies that allow you to easily tap into this unapologetic energy, or that support it in some way. But squares or oppositions are energies that may either trigger this untamed wound, or they could be a source of healing that one may need to take or make an effort towards in order to establish a healthier relationship relationship with shame and to allow that untamed aspect to roam free. And this is because that planetary energy, may naturally not see eye to eye with this Lilith energy. And so it could be a source of healing, but also a sense of tension. And so those are kind of like the summary of the aspects made to these different points that I'll be talking about, but you probably want to see it in practice, right? I know you want to see it in practice. And so with that being said, let's now look at some subscribers' birth charts to see how we could interpret these aspects within their birth chart and to sort of like outline how they may play out for the native. And while I do this, the goal is number one, to inform them on what this energy could look like. And number two, I want to provide guidance on this energy to help them, navigate it to the best of their ability. And so while interpreting these charts, the aim will always be to do both. And so now let's get into it. Okay, starting with this first client right here, I want to use their chart as an example to kind of show how I get these aspects. And you can see right here, there is a table on the graph with all of the major points. And if you also look in the little squares next to the planets and the placements, you see these little symbols. These represent the aspects that are being made. And so if you have a line with two circles like this, that is an opposition. If you have like a little asterisk or a little, star, that's a sextile. The square is the easiest one. That's literally a square. If you have this little circle with a line, that is a conjunction. And if you have a triangle, that is a trine. And so that's a basic way to read the table. You may also notice that points like the IC or the DC or the South Node aren't included on this table, but that's okay because for this reading, it is worth noting that, the North Node is opposite the South Node, or the Ascendant is opposite the Descendant, and the Midheaven is opposite the IC. And so any aspects being made to these 3 points will also kind of relate to their opposing point. And so it kind of just helps us to save time, to not be as redundant, but also when we are interpreting the aspects for these points, we will consider what the other side of that coin looks like. So if we are interpreting ascendant aspects, we will consider how that looks to, the descendant, or how that looks from the perspective of others. And then the third thing I want to note is that when I am reading aspects to these points, aka the nodes and the angles and Lilith, I will only be looking at aspects made to the actual planets themselves, so Sun through Pluto. And so if there is an aspect, for example, between the Ascendant and Lilith, I won't be necessarily looking at that because they are two abstract points aspecting, which can show up especially in conjunctions, but it's not as strong as, say, an aspect made to a planet. And so I will highlight sort of the region in which I will be looking at when it comes to the aspects. Those are just a few notes I want to start with. And so now let's get into the reading. So the first step I do, like I've done with all of my other readings, is I like to write down the what first. Before I do any interpretations, before I go in and try to dissect the chart, I want to write down the actual placements and the aspects that are relevant just to get it in front of me, just so I don't panic and just so I have kind of that holistic view before I go into the interpretation. And so for this person, we wrote, their North Node is in Scorpio in the 2nd house. And then also we have that it squares Mercury and Aquarius in the 5th house. You can see by the square, sextile to Venus in Capricorn in the 4th house, and then trine Saturn in Pisces in the 6th house. That is all the aspects being made to actual planets, and so we can stop there. And then I do the same thing with Black Moon Lilith, write down all the aspects, do the same thing with the Ascendant, and then I do the same thing with the Midheaven. And it is worth noting with the Midheaven, I have to write down what house it's in. For this client, it's in the 10th house. That's not going to be the case for everybody. It could be in the 9th house or the 11th house. And for some people, it's in the 8th house or the 12th house, depending on, where you live. And so I will write down the house. And you do notice there are other points in the table that I didn't really mention. You have the Lot of Fortune and the vertex. From my experience, Lot of Fortune aspects don't matter as much as the ruler of the Lot of Fortune. I already did another video kind of on this. I can go more into it in another video. So Aspects to the Lot of Fortune don't really matter in case you're curious. Same thing with the vertex, because the vertex is a fated point that is usually only activated by conjunctions or oppositions, so not going to go into that as well. And you can also probably notice I am using whole sign houses. You can use Placidus for this type of read. I find both house systems to be accurate in their own nuanced way. I would work with what works for you, but because I know a lot of people who sent their charts for this video are beginners, I want to start with whole signs because it makes the house implications a lot more cleaner. And then the last thing I want to note about this section is that obviously, you know, these placements can have a lot more nuance to them based on the ruler of that sign. And so, for example, they are a Libra ascendant, and so the ruler is Venus. That is not what this video is about. And so all of the interpretations and implications that I will go through in this video won't really focus, you know, on the rulers, but I do want to let you know that they are relevant. I can go through house rulers in another video if you want, but even aside from that, the implications and the tips and tricks that I will give in this video will still be super relevant and super helpful. And so now let's actually get into it. This person has a lot of aspects made to Black Moon Lilith, and so I kind of want to go step by step through this person's Black Moon Lilith. I will go through the other points such as the ascendant and the descendant in my other examples, or the north node and the south node. I will also go over that in other examples, but let's kind of focus on how do I work through this step by step. And so as you know, in step 1, I wrote down all the placements and all of the aspects. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a very basic definition of what this placement means, but also how it can look, because you can look up a definition for any of these placements or these aspects online and get a very vague and general definition. I do want my definition to be very general and vague because, as you know, I like to build on that later. But then when it comes to how the aspect can look, I think that's where the real magic is, because it helps the native really visualize how it can play out in their life. And so this person, Black Moon Lilith and Gemini in the 9th house, what does that mean? We know Black Moon Lilith is a point of raw, unapologetic self-expression, and this is framed by Gemini energy. How does Gemini energy look? It's very clever, investigative, curious. And then this also occurs in the 9th house. And what does the 9th house mean? It's the area of higher learning, expansion, and belief systems. And this is where you kind of have to brainstorm, because you have to say, okay, how can the energy of Black Moon Lilith and Gemini in the 9th house all combine together? And so I write down how it looks. Maybe this can manifest as feeling like a black sheep for their unconventional beliefs or philosophies in some way. Maybe they had religious differences or belief differences or cultural differences from other people. Or maybe they have a raw, untamed curiosity that makes them compulsively question truths in a way that maybe others can find disruptive or shallow. And this can make this person feel very misunderstood. And so that is just one example on how this placement can play out. Once I do that, I go through all of the aspects and I give a very, very, very basic definition for what the aspects can mean. And so for Lilith square sun, for example, we see that this indicates an energy that is in dynamic tension with this untamed moon, and it requires conscious effort to integrate. That is because this is the definition of a square. It requires tension, but you can use conscious effort to integrate it. I'd leave it at that for now. I keep it very simple. Like I said, I will elaborate on that later. Same thing with Lilith square moon. It indicates an energy that is in dynamic tension with this untamed wound, and it requires conscious effort to integrate. And I do the same thing with all of the other aspects, except I talk about the nature of that aspect. And so with a trine with Mercury and Black Moon Lilith, it indicates the energy allows this person to easily tap into this untamed energy, or this energy supports it. And then I go through every single aspect doing the same thing. And now it's time to elaborate, because after I get these basic definitions, I give a little bit of blended examples on how the aspect from Black Moon Lilith to the particular planet could play out. And I like to give, more than one definition, because for some people an aspect can be a little bit more internally felt. Maybe it affects how they feel internally, but sometimes it's about the external expression. And so I want to kind of cover both. And so for the blended examples, going back to Sun square Lilith, maybe their core identity and its drive for innovation, because it is touched on by Aquarius, and creative expression, which is touched on by the 5th house, could feel at odds with this raw, misunderstood point. And so how can this look? You kind of have to brainstorm, okay, how can the identity and maybe, themes of shame or the Black Moon Lilith themes of being misunderstood combine with the 5th house and the 9th house and, the Aquarian and Gemini energy? And so one example, maybe they want to share a unique creative project or a vision, but they feel a raw wound triggered if they feel othered or if they feel like they're being judged. And so this can create a little bit of self-consciousness. Or another example, maybe there's a reoccurring tension between their desire to be unapologetic about their beliefs, but also their ego's drive for creative pleasure. How can this look? Maybe they find it hard to just have fun because their raw intellectual side keeps seeing the parts of the situation that feel compromised or inauthentic. And so these are just a few ways this can play out. And I do the same thing with all of the other aspects. Let's go to a generational planet just so that you know how this looks. And so we have Black Moon Lilith trine Uranus, for example. And so maybe sudden innovative insights that restructure their private foundation could flow easily and support the expression of this raw energy. And for the example, I'm like, oh, maybe they have a sudden decision to change their living situation. Uranus in the 4th either likes to rebel, from childhood patterns, childhood wounds. That could mean from like an internal standpoint, but it could also mean literal relocation. But this could also feel like it's aligned with their needs to express their beliefs in some way. Like maybe they're willing to rebel against, their past or their home or their living situation because their independent beliefs are untamed. And this will be a little bit more flowing when it comes to the trine. And so after I do this with all of the aspects, I want to kind of have a consensus on how this Black Moon Lilith looks as a whole, because we have these little pieces of the puzzle. How do we put these pieces together to form one cohesive vision? And so at this point, I brainstorm. I say their raw, untamed psychological point is unapologetic, it's clever, and it relates to beliefs and knowledge. This is the definition of Black Moon Lilith and Gemini in the 9th house. And I kind of come to conclusions about the overall energy. And so their flowing potential is significant. And this shadow side has powerful, easy outlets because there's trines to Mercury and Uranus, which support this. And this can look like finding a natural and even fun way to like sort of creatively express their othered ideas, and maybe their unique private life provides the foundation for this rebellion. This is kind of combining the nature of both trines and really brainstorming how this can look by elementally saying, okay, how does the 5th house and the 4th house and the 9th house, how do they combine? Okay, how do Uranus and Mercury and Black Moon Lilith, how do those combine? But then I also want to go into where the active energy is needed. And so for them, it's not finding their raw voice, but in managing the tension it creates, because there are hard aspects, but with squares to the sun and moon and also oppositions to Pluto that show that their ego and emotions could be triggered when they feel othered, or maybe if their ideas aren't validated. And this requires conscious effort to separate, their intellectual shadow from their need for creative and group approval, and to navigate intense communications because Pluto's in their 3rd house without letting this wound get to them. And I'm not gonna lie, you're probably like, how did she even come up with this? If I'm being honest, it comes from, practicing looking at the houses, practicing looking at the signs, practice on as many charts as you can to understand, okay, what can the 5th house mean? What can this house mean? What can that house mean? And then, kind of creating like your own little cocktail of energies and brainstorming what that energy can look like in real life, but also trying to look at it from as many angles as possible. It only comes from practice. I hope that this video kind of helps you to understand the mindset to get into. And then the final stage, I go into tangible tips to managing each aspect. And when it comes to the tips to managing the aspects, I go through every aspect because trines and sextiles, for example, those aren't the ones that we can ignore. Those aren't the aspects that don't need work, whereas, the squares and oppositions and conjunctions need work. That's not how it works. Every aspect, can have a good expression and a bad expression, because trines, for example, they are talent but can be a little bit lazy. Squares, for example, people say they're tough, they can feel tense, but they're also a source of growth and initiative. And so every side of the coin has a good side and a bad side. And so I go through every aspect and I think of, okay, what is one piece of advice that would be the best expression of every channeled energy, and how can they tap into that best expression, whether it's a square, a trine, or an opposition. And so a few examples is, let's say we're looking at their sun square Lilith. And so maybe if their ego or their identity feels judged for how it expresses itself, it's very likely that this square is being triggered. And so a tip for them to manage this is to give their shadow side its own separate stage. They can create a separate private creative outlet from the one that they show the world. Maybe it's a journal or a blog or an anonymous account, just so that this exiled Black Moon Lilith ideas can really play out and this person can become familiar with learning to balance being judged, so that if they do have to go into the public facing area one day with their takes, that they're able to sort of build up their confidence when it comes to this. And then let's look at, a tip for a trine. So for their Mercury trine, maybe a tip is when they feel that energy building, when they feel that raw, untamed Black Moon Lilith energy building, which they can identify by, when they really feel passionate about their ideas, they're encouraged not to suppress it, because when they suppress it, the trine can't play out, especially because, Mercury, it relates to communications or, their intellect. And so if they mentally repress that, it won't express itself. And so if they write it down, create something, if they use their Mercury energy towards this Black Moon Lilith energy to express it, it gives them a natural, healthy outlet to really let their opinions shine. And so that is just an example on how I do a reading like this. And then when I polish up, how aspects are in the birth chart, it will look a little something like this, which I will have down in the description. And so with that being said, let's move on to the next chart. Right here, we have chart number 2, step 1 that we always do. And if you want to do this with your own chart, this will also help as well. Write down all of the aspects, look at the tables. I start by writing down the sign and house of each placement. And so for this person, North Node in Gemini in the 4th, Black Moon Lilith in Capricorn in the 11th, Ascendant in Pisces, and then Midheaven in Sagittarius in the 10th house. I write all of those down, and then I go into the aspects. And like I said, you go on the table, and I will kind of just visually show you. Let's say for the North Node, you want to look at this row that I have highlighted or circled here, and then to see what planet each aspect corresponds to. So for this one, they have North Node in Gemini, and then you see the very first square next to North Node in Gemini, you see a square. And so you kind of trace your finger up to see what planet is making that square, and boom, you see that it's the sun. And then you go a little bit over on the same row of the North Node. Oh, you see a little star or an asterisk. What do we say that is? Oh, that's a sextile. Then you move up. Oh, that sextile is to Venus. And so you do that process, writing down the sign and the house and the aspect involved with all of the points for the North Node and Lilith and Ascendant and the Midheaven. For this person's chart, I want to go into the nodes and sort of break down how I would interpret the nodes, because this person does have a diverse set of, nodal aspects in their birth chart. And so as we wrote down, they have North Node in Gemini in the 4th house. And so I write down the basic meaning. Okay, this frames your life's narrative, and the plot is pulling you towards themes of Gemini, which is clever, investigative, and curious. It's similar to Lilith that we talked about in the first chart when when it comes to the themes. You kind of just over time pick up the themes of each zodiac sign. So you know that Gemini means clever, investigative, and curious. Or let's say you want Virgo, you know that it's detail oriented, it's of service, it's logical. And so eventually you just learn what all of the signs mean. And I do have a link in the description for what all of the signs or the planets mean in case you really want to know, in case you are a beginner and you don't know, oh, when I'm talking about Saturn, what does that mean? Or if I'm talking about Leo, what does that mean? And that's just a good place to start, and that knowledge will eventually build on. And so for this person, they are being pulled towards the themes of Gemini because it's in the 4th house. This narrative arc is on focusing on the area of home or roots or innermost self. And it's important to note when it comes to the home and roots and innermost self, it can mean your literal tangible home. It could mean your past, but it can also mean your innermost sense of safety and security. I find that with transits or aspects to the North Node, it doesn't always mean your physical tangible home, but anything that you consider home, that is what the 4th house is. And so how can this look? Maybe this can manifest as a life story focused on moving away from a public, dogmatic, or big picture position, meaning maybe this person has a tendency to want to focus on achievement or focus on the big picture or focus on, achievement, whatever it may be. And this is, like I said, because the table only shows the North Node aspects, I'm folding in what the South Node can look like as well. And so this person is meant to move away from this public, dogmatic, or big picture view and towards a more curious, communicative, and localized private life. And this journey may be about learning to communicate or maybe understand their roots and building their own psychological foundation. And like I mentioned in my North Node video, you are not abandoning your South Node. Just because you have North Node in the 4th house, for example, does not mean that you can't achieve anything. It doesn't mean you won't have a career. It doesn't mean you'll never be famous. It just means that whenever you pursue that North Node energy, it really is like the conscious focus, but the South Node energy is still something to be leaned into. It still plays out. And so I always make sure to note of that whenever I do a reading. And then we go through the aspects. We go through North Node square Sun in Pisces. And like I said, write down the basic definition. This indicates an energy of dynamic tension with their life's plot, and it requires active effort to integrate. And note, when something squares the North Node, it will also square the South Node. And so that's just an important note as well. And then, North Node sextile Venus in Aries in the 2nd house. This indicates an energy that easily aligns and supports with their narrative. And I go through all of the aspects, and I kind of write down that basic definition of what that aspect looks like before I go into the definitions and the examples. And then I kind of take a breather, I analyze, and then I work through how this can look. When it comes to the blended examples, I want to start with the North Node trine Saturn and the North Node opposite Neptune. Those are the two I'm going to go deep in, but if you want to read the rest, like I said, link in the description with this full reading. And so, North Node trident Saturn. Okay, what is the nature of Saturn? What is the nature of Scorpio? What is the nature of the 9th house? And then what is the nature of Gemini? And what is the nature of the North Node and the 4th house? And so, maybe their discipline and structure that they apply to their deep beliefs or their deep pull towards finding discipline and structure within what they believe will flow harmoniously into their life's plot. That is what the North Node is. It's kind of like your life's plot. It's not a tangible space, but like I said, it frames your life and the energy that you're meant to go towards. But it flows harmoniously with their life's plot of learning about their roots. And then I think, okay, how can this look? How do the 9th house and the 4th house connect? How can Gemini and Scorpio connect? And how can Saturn and the North Node connect? Like I said, it comes with practice. And so maybe their disciplined study of psychology or deep philosophies can provide the perfect and easy framework for understanding their own family or inner self. Or maybe their structured truth-seeking provides a foundation for their plot of asking questions about their private life. That sounds a little bit confusing, but that's where the example comes from. And so maybe this can look like a deep commitment to a belief system that, rather than being dogmatic, encourages them to be curious and understand their own psychology. And this is good because it helps them sort of go towards that North Node energy, which can help them find balance and fulfillment in life. But then what about opposition? I know what you're thinking. Well, we'll go into that. We'll go into their North Node opposite Neptune in Sagittarius aspect. We'll go into examples on how this can look. Remember, oppositions are kind of this like balance push-pull energy, but remember that if something is opposite the North Node, it is probably conjunct the South Node, and so they feel a pull towards a visionary, expansive, and perhaps illusory public role, but this could be in a little bit of tension with their plot line, which demands to move towards a more grounded and factual private life. If you don't know how that looks, maybe they want to be a visionary, or maybe they really have this dream of achieving something big and expansive, and this can sort of, fight with the fact that maybe they are pulled towards being more of a private student with North Node in the 4th house. And so this energy almost pulls them away from that 10th house default. And I know what you're thinking. This doesn't mean it removes their public role or their reputation. It doesn't mean that they're not meant to be Neptunian or Sagittarian or 10th house like. It just means that they can't rely on it as a crutch. And so another example, maybe their comfort zone is to be idealistic and known publicly. Maybe they feel like this is their comfort zone, or this is what they want to achieve, but their fulfillment is in being curious and private. And so maybe they feel a constant pull to their career, or maybe a glamorous public dream, but they feel that deeper feeling that they are avoiding the real work to understanding how their own mind and home really looks. But when they balance both aspects, like if they go towards their Gemini 4th house North Node, if they really, embrace that learning in the private realm, then they can then begin to sort of see that visibility that is a bit more dreamy or idealistic start to play out. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they have to work towards that 10th house energy. It just means that when they work on that internal energy, then it will be in balance with that external energy, and then both can be in balance, both can play out, and this person can have more karmic fulfillment. Then once I do that, like I said, I go to the consensus, I write down, what this energy can look like for them. What is the full story of their North Node? What is the full story of how their karmic path and journey really looks? And I consider all of the aspects when writing this down, but I also consider how all of these aspects play into one cohesive story. And so you'll read that, the central plot of their life is a journey towards building a curious, communicative, private foundation, and their flow, and then I go into their flowing potential. Okay, what helps them with this? What can that look like? But also I will go into where active energy is needed and how to do that. And then once I sort of get this big picture view, I'll go into the tips and tricks. And I like these tips and tricks to be applicable no matter where you are in life, but I do like them to be tangible, because I know a lot of people who, write tips and tricks, they're like, just keep your cool during rough situations. They say this tip that's very vague and not very helpful, and then you're sitting there like, okay, well, thanks, Mr. Obvious. And so if you give these people a tool for every aspect, that is the best way to help them turn their chart into a tangible practice that they can take with them into the everyday world. This is what the tips and tricks look like, and this is what the whole reading will look like. Obviously, I would go deeper if this was a full natal chart reading. I would go into the nuance of the rulers, and I'd also look up Placidus. There's a lot that goes into it, but this is a really good starting point if you're beginning. And then for this third person's chart, I want to go into aspects being made to both their midheaven and their ascendant, because this person has a lot of tension with their ascendant, but also this person does not have a lot of aspects with their midheaven. And honestly, I know a lot of people will be saying, well, what if I only have tense aspects? Or, what if I even don't have a lot of aspects to this angle? Is it even going to really matter? Is this even going to affect me? Yes. And honestly, even in my own chart, I only have one aspect, actually two technically, to my midheaven. I only have a square from Uranus and an opposition from Chiron. I have no trines or sextiles to my midheaven. And even with my ascendant, I only have one trine, and it is a very similar trine to this. And I only have squares and oppositions aside from that. But that doesn't mean that, my appearance isn't cool. That doesn't mean I can't build a public role or a reputation that is, actually visible and tangible and helpful to the world. It just means that it's going to be flavored a little bit differently, and there's not going to really be as much, nuance or noise as to how those placements are defined. And it's as simple as that. So before you ask and say, oh, my placements are bad, that's my answer. And if you ask me that question in the comments and you didn't even get to this part of the video, then that's kind of your fault. And so I won't answer it, but I'll answer any other questions. Anyway, step 1, write down all of the aspects. Boom, I already have that. You see that, to their ascendant, they have a sextile to their sun, but then they have a bunch of squares. Don't worry, I'll get into that. And then you go to their midheaven. This person has their midheaven in Capricorn in the 9th house. Another reason this person's midheaven is interesting is it's not in their 10th house. And that does flavor your career to a little bit of a degree, or it does flavor your public role or your reputation to a little bit of a degree. And they only have one aspect to a planet, and that is a conjunction to Neptune. That is it. You do see there's a trine to their north node, yes, but like I said, when you have an intangible point making an aspect to another intangible point, it's not going to be as loud. Obviously, it will still be there. It just won't be as loud, so I'm not going to touch on that in this video. And so we're only going to be touching on their conjunction to Neptune. And I also want to touch on this because, they don't have trines or sextiles or squares. What does that mean? And the actual answer is you would look at their midheaven ruler, which is, their Saturn in Aries in the 12th house. If I were to really go more deeply into this, you would see, Saturn is in Aries in their 12th house. And so maybe addressing subconscious confident issues because, Aries is a sign of confidence. I have my Saturn in Aries. When you have Saturn in Aries, it can sort of limit or block your confidence because you don't have all of the answers right now, because Saturn likes to build. Aries is, a very forward-moving sign, and so it kind of feels bad about itself that it doesn't have all of its stuff together right away. And for this person, it's in their subconscious, and so really diving into that subconscious will really help this person with tangible public achievement. That's a story for another day. We're going to go into what their midheaven means in isolation, only with a conjunction and no other aspects. But before we do that, let's go into the ascendant. So their ascendant is in Taurus. What does this mean on a very basic level? It means that their lens is framed, because that's what the ascendant is. The sun is the actual ego, whereas the ascendant is kind of the frame of your personality. It's how it's projected, and it's not just how it's perceived. You are actually, seeing life through the lens of your ascendant. So it is how you're perceived, but it's also how you project as well. And so this suggests that their identity is presented with a natural inclination towards being maybe steady, methodical, or grounded. Or there's something about their appearance that is, very steady and methodical and grounded. It doesn't mean that that's actually who they are. It doesn't mean that they, don't have their little cray-cray moments. It just means that this is like the mask that they have, but also this mask maybe it values security, stability, the tangible in the sensory world. And so maybe, for example, they have a solid or very rooted physical presence. Maybe they move very slowly. Maybe a calm and steady demeanor, at least upon first impression. Or maybe they have a pleasant or lulling voice. I know a lot of Taurus risings appear a little bit slow or maybe deliberate or comfort seeking. I would take what resonates with that, because some Taurus risings look slow. But for example, if their Venus is in a sign that isn't very slow, they can be a little faster. Maybe they just look comfort seeking at the very least. And like I said, this doesn't mean this is actually who they are. This is just, how they are being framed. And because this person has a lot of squares to their ascendant, maybe they have a very complex personality that can look very, very different depending on who they're around. But regardless, that Taurian kind of solid appearance will be present no matter what. And so going through the aspects, they do have a sextile to their sun in Pisces. And so maybe this indicates that their energy is easily aligned and supports their projected identity. And so with sun in the 11th house, how can that look? Oh, their core identity is maybe compassionate. Maybe it's very kind to their friends, or maybe they're very grounded and sort of this soft, empathetic presence within their 11th house frame. And so how can this look? Maybe people see you as community focused or empathetic, and maybe this is a natural part of their stable and reliable personality. Maybe they're the rock for their friends, or maybe this could look like supporting your community with practical, steady compassion, which does feel very natural and authentic to you. They're just a very naturally compassionate person, and this will extend to either their friend groups or society in some way. That's how a good or a flowing aspect can look to the ascendant. And now let's go through squares. I just want to first debunk the thing that squares to your ascendant does not make someone ugly, okay? I have Venus square my ascendant, although, I guess some people would argue I'm ugly. I don't think objectively it makes me look ugly, although some people would, disagree. But it does mean that there is kind of this tension or this nuance between what they project in the world, or maybe how they appear with the actual trait of the planet. And so for this person, they have the ascendant square their moon in Leo in the 4th house. And so maybe their inner emotional landscape and its need for expressive or creative validation in their private life, maybe they want to feel warm and safe and secure and want to be very expressive and vibrant in their private life, but this is in tension in some way with their stoic and steady mask. How can this look? Maybe they appear a little more calm or unbothered than they actually are, but internally maybe they have intense emotion and a strong urge for recognition that they don't really know how to express. And so their emotions are not aligned with, how they appear. And so maybe when it comes to their appearance or their ascendant, they could have trouble finding emotional fulfillment solely through that appearance. They're going to need a little more effort. Or maybe their emotional moon or their home base is very dramatic and warm, which feels at odds with their simple, grounded appearance. And so maybe people are surprised that their private innermost self is so expressive and needs the spotlight. Maybe they're the type of person who warms up to people after you get to know them, but maybe they have their public-facing lens that looks a little more reserved. It looks like they have it together. Another good example for me is when I first started astrology, I had a lot of people say, oh, you're so fake and happy all the time and you have no depth. But my Venus square is my ascendant in Scorpio. So my ascendant is in Leo. My Venus is in Scorpio. And I want people to, see all of this depth that I have. But it kind of contrasts with that warmth that I naturally let out, and it confuses some people. And so if there is a square to your ascendant, there could be a part of you that, takes people by surprise, or it confuses people, or because it's not really, traditionally associated with how people would perceive or stereotype you. And so another example is they have ascendant square Jupiter in Aquarius in the 10th house. And so maybe they have a drive to grow and expand. Maybe they're very ambitious and innovative, but this creates tension with their needs for stability and, slow, methodical change. A good example of how this can look is maybe their career could be pushing them to expand in new tech-focused or innovative ways, but their personal mask could feel resistant, slow, and wants to do things a steady way. Or maybe their big, expansive public role creates tension with their simple, grounded persona, and maybe they have an unconventional and large career, or at least the desire to have one, but maybe they feel personally uncomfortable with the attention, preferring a simple and private existence. And so there's something about how they want to grow and expand that's a little more eccentric than their natural grounded presence horizons, and this can create a little bit of tension. And squares to the 10th house versus squares to the 4th house is a little bit different, because squares to the 10th house could mean, oh, what they achieve or what they want to achieve is very different from how they present to the world, whereas the 4th house is like, oh, maybe I'm looking like I'm this way, but in secret I'm actually this way. And so squares to the 10th house and the 4th house will look a little bit different, so just make a note of that if you're looking at your own chart. And I kind of follow this practice with the rest of their aspects, kind of spelling out how this may look, what this may look like, and then I go into the consensus. I state, what is the flowing potential of this ascendant? Oh, where is energy needed? And where is the effort needed? And then I go into the tips and tricks for every aspect. I want to move on to the midheaven now, though. I want to spell out what a midheaven or what any point can look like if it doesn't have a lot of aspects. First, I write down what midheaven and Capricorn in the 9th house looks like. And so when you have a 9th house midheaven, there's something about their work or their role or their public reputation that could relate to higher learning, expansion, travel, going out of their comfort zone. This doesn't mean that's their job now, but it could mean that if they are to achieve visibility or their ideal career in their life, it could focus on these higher learning or expansive themes. And so maybe they're a structured professional or a serious philosopher, or maybe they're an authority on international law, or this is just somebody who works in a role that allows them to expand their horizons in a structured way. And so I combine the energy of the 9th house and Capricorn and public role, and I kind of think of how this can look, and these were just a few examples that I can think of, but obviously there is a million others that they can look at, and obviously their Saturn in the 12th house could matter. And so maybe, they teach or expand through, their subconscious sort of barriers. Like maybe they're, an inspiring therapist or a public speaker, and they really aim to expand people's horizons through, working through their own shadow side. I didn't write this down, but this is something that you could look at, like I said, when it comes to reading how aspects for any point can play out. You can look at the ruler, you can look at the location, and kind of brainstorm, what flavor it gives it. And then remember, they only have one aspect to their midheaven. It is conjunct Neptune in the 9th house. And so this indicates an energy that is directly linked and fused with their public role. And so maybe their public role is something that's idealistic, it's visionary, empathetic, or illusory, because these are associated with Neptune. And this is infused with their public role as a structured authority on big ideas, Capricorn in the 9th house. And so maybe their public role is to be a structured dreamer. Maybe they're seen as an authority of spiritual philosophies, or maybe they extend compassion in a structured way within their role. But also this fusion makes their public scaffolding very visionary, but also maybe foggy or ill-defined within a practical Capricorn network. What this could look like. Maybe they're known publicly as an expert in an abstract field like art history, compassionate law, or humanitarian organization on a global scale. But there could be abstract qualities to their role, although this would be the main weapon within their role. And so maybe there's something about their role that is very Capricornian, it's very structured, but it also touches on those Neptunian foggy themes as well. Maybe they have to deal with foggy themes. I think therapy is another way that this could look, or maybe they deal with secret classified information. This is because Neptune energy is a little bit secret, but also the ruler of their Capricorn midheaven is in their 12th house. Just another thing to consider. When it comes to the consensus of the aspects, it becomes a little bit simple. I just kind of summarize what midheaven conjunct Neptune can look like in multiple ways, where active energy is needed, what their potential is. I like to show the positive and the negatives, and then I put it all together, and then I come up with tangible tips. And so because this person only had one aspect to their midheaven, I made the tip a little bit longer. And so for this person, maybe their public role is fused with their ideals, and the potential is to have a career that's their mission. And so maybe to do this, they need to write down their mission. They need to put form or structure or create a plan, a Capricornian plan, Capricorn midheavens can work numerous fields. It's just about putting structure to whatever they are doing. And so my tips and tricks really sort of tailored to help them create structure for their career. And this is to help them, find a direction, because Neptune and Saturn are two very different planets. If they don't put structure to their dreams, then their dreams just stay as dreams. And so that's what I focused on creating their tip. And then I get a reading that looks like this. Now, if you want to see the full readings, I do have the link down in the description. And if you want a kind of basic framework on how I work through everything and what the aspects and the planets mean, also down in the description. Thank you so much if you've watched up to this point. I really hope it's helpful. And once again, if you want to be in a future video where I read your birth chart in some capacity, email me your information. I have the email down in the description in case you want it. And until then, I will see you next time.